Doing any sort of compliance assessment on any sort of hosting provider is normally not a simple task. Indeed, it can be a very bureaucratic, paperwork-laden process. But when we start talking about how that's done on cloud providers, it starts to become quite complex. Certainly it's something I went through many times in the corporate environment, and it was never simple. There was always a lot of to and fro, and ultimately a lot of compromise as well. And in this clip, I want to talk about some of the things that you need to consider when it comes to assessing a cloud provider. Let's start with some of the information that can be a bit difficult to get from them. So for example, something as simple as a physical address. I've seen cases where the organisation involved would expect that a hosting provider would simply give them the address of where their data center is located. Yet as this organisation started to transform into the cloud, I saw reluctance from cloud providers to provide that information, because often it is part of their security posture not to disclose the physical location. Now this might be something which we could refer to as security through obscurity. Let's just not tell them where the data center is, and that might reduce the risk of someone finding it. But be that as it may, this is the way some cloud providers choose to operate. And this is a piece of information that can be difficult to obtain. Certain internal procedures can also be difficult to garner from the cloud provider, and they often don't want to disclose this information for a variety of reasons. Sometimes there's a competitive advantage in their particular processes. Other times they feel it may put some of their defenses at risk if they were to describe how these procedures work. In fact, that's often the rationale for not wanting to disclose certain security defenses. For example, it's very difficult to understand precisely what sort of distributed denial of service defenses a cloud provider has. And it does make sense, because were that information to become public, that could be used by an adversary to try and circumvent those controls. Certainly, that is the rationale of cloud providers that don't like to provide these pieces of information. Now, for organizations doing compliance assessments, this becomes a difficult task because you now need to meet somewhere in the middle. They need to gather enough information to be confident in their choice of cloud provider, yet also not exceed the levels of information that the cloud provider themselves are willing to provide. However, cloud providers are usually happy to provide quite a bit of information about other aspects of their security profile. Let me show you what I mean. Just as cloud providers try to get economies of scale from having large rollouts of infrastructure, they also often try to kill many birds with one stone by demonstrating the compliance standards that they meet. So for example, in Microsoft's case, in their Trust Center, they talk about a number of different standards they comply to. And as I scroll through this list, you'll see that many of these are regional standards or standards implemented by an individual country, but others are very well recognized international standards or requirements. So things like FIPS, HIPAA, and PCI. And in fact, if we have a look at PCI, we can see that Azure is compliant with PCI DSS version 3.1, which of course governs the way payment cards need to be stored, processed, and transmitted. On drilling down into their PCI page, we can see quite a bit of information about the compliance level they've achieved. But that also includes a bit of information here about the actual services for which they've achieved PCI compliance. Now this might look like quite a comprehensive set of services, and it is, but it's also not everything. Just putting your things in Microsoft's Azure cloud does not make them PCI compliant. Not only are there certain services that haven't achieved that compliance, but of course you can still make an application non-compliant even when it's placed inside a PCI DSS compliant environment. You can still mess up the compliance. But the point is that even though you may not be able to get all the same answers around compliance assessments from a cloud provider, you'll very frequently find quite a robust set of other standards that they've reached. And they're usually very happy to make those documents public too. Let me show you one more thing before we wrap up this piece on compliance. And it's about what happens when cloud goes wrong. This is a story from down here in Australia in 2011, and it relates to an Aussie hosting provider that was previously known as Distribute IT. They suffered a really serious attack which, as the story says here, effectively left the company's servers unrecoverable. They lost all of their client sites, all of their data, all of their backups. Gone forever. This clearly had a major impact on Distribute IT. They had to shut down, but it also had a massive impact on those who had chosen to use this cloud provider. This is precisely the reason why organisations want to do compliance assessments. They want to establish with some degree of confidence that the provider they're putting their data in isn't going to suffer a fate the same as Distribute IT. Now, you can never be 100% certain about this. There is no absolute position of security. However, this has become almost the canonical reference for why a process of assessment and verification of which cloud data should go into is important. So that's compliance assessments. Let's now move on and start talking about penetration testing.